Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, in today's episode, we are talking all about isometric training for hikers. And before I get into and explain exactly what that is and what it's all about and why it can be so handy for hikers, essentially, I just want to explain what has inspired this episode today. So, essentially, a couple of episodes back, we had our 300th episode. And inside there, I shared 30 tips around training for hiking that we've sort of gleaned over 300 episodes of this podcast. And one of the tips I shared was the benefits or the usefulness of what's known as isometric training. And following that episode, I got a few emails from people literally asking about that, like how you apply it, what it's all about, and just a couple of follow-ups around that. So I thought, you know what, it might actually be useful to do a full episode around this subject because it can be a really cool area to explore for any hiker, whether you're a beginner hiker, intermediate hiker, whether you're preparing for a big trip or whatever it may be. Isometric training can be a really useful addition. So today I'm going to be exploring, what isometric training is, the benefits it can have for hikers, and a few different ways you can kind of add this into your training and incorporate it into your workouts. So essentially, to start with, what is isometric training? So essentially, to explain this, we're going to get a little bit technical and we're going to talk a little bit about what's known as muscle contraction. So essentially, the way your muscles produce force. So essentially, your muscles contract and produce force in three different ways. There's concentric muscle contractions, eccentric muscle contractions, and isometric muscle contractions. So a concentric muscle contraction is pretty straightforward. I'm going to use the example of a bicep curl here. And basically a biceps curl, I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, but basically, just holding your arms down your side, bringing it up to your shoulders. Now, a concentric muscle contraction is essentially when the muscle contracts while it's getting shorter. So this is typically what we sort of feel like is the harder part of any of the strength training movements. So in a bicep exercise, it's essentially when you're moving the weight upwards and you feel that, weight getting harder and harder and harder as you come up. And if you put your hand on your bicep, you can feel it getting shorter and shorter and shorter as it's contracting, getting more tense. That's what's known as a concentric muscle contraction. Now, on the opposite side of things, an eccentric muscle contraction is essentially when the muscle contracts while it's actually getting longer. So in that bicep curl example, this is in the lowering portion where we're lowering the weight. The muscle's getting a little bit longer, but it is also contracting because it's not just letting the weight drop. There is still tension in the muscle, and the muscle is still contracting while it is lowering. And so every single repetition we do in a gym, in an exercise, strength training, or whatever it may be, has that concentric and eccentric component. Now, isometric muscle contractions. These are essentially muscle contractions where the muscles actually don't change length. So if you were using that bicep curl example, if we maybe went halfway up in a bicep curl and your elbow is at 90 degrees and you're literally just holding a weight there and you're not actually moving, that's what was known as an isometric muscle contraction because the muscles are contracting to hold that weight there. It's really tough. It's really difficult. But the muscle is not actually getting longer or shorter. It's just staying in one place. And that is what's known as an isometric muscle contraction. Now, a typical thing that a lot of hikers will have done at some stage or another is a wall sit. So basically, when you go sit against a wall, sit down a squat position, you just hold that position. In that particular position, your quads are going through an isometric muscle contraction. The front of your thighs, they're contracting, they're holding you up there, but you're not actually moving. And that's a typical example a lot of people use. And this type of exercise, it's not really utilized very much in the world of training, and especially in the world of training for hiking, because we usually think about doing repetitions, going up and down, up and down, up and down. And, this isometric stuff, it gets a little bit neglected. But it can be super beneficial in a few different ways. Now, benefit number one, is probably the biggest benefit in this type of training, is it can be really good for people who do struggle with pain or discomfort. Because there is a reasonable amount of evidence to show that isometric training can actually have what's known as an analgesic effect on some joints or on some tendons. Now, what that means is it's kind of like, if you're doing an isometric exercise and it's loading up a particular joint, and maybe you get, issues in your knees, and you do a particular isometric exercises which loads up that knee in an isometric way, if you do it right, it can actually have an analgesic effect, meaning it makes things feel more comfortable. It's like taking a painkiller almost. It's not, the same effect. It's not the same route, but it's the same sort of thing. You get a bit of relief from pain for a certain amount of time. So for people who are in pain, this type of training can be really, really, really handy if you use it right. Because number one, it can help you get that analgesic effect and help things feel more comfortable. And some people even use these exercises at the start of a workout to get that analgesic effect and then do the rest of the workout. And they'll be able to get through that more comfortably. Or alternatively, it can be a good way where you can just add some extra load to the muscles, to the joints, to the tendons, and challenge yourself in a way that probably isn't going to aggravate things. So it can be, if used right, can be really, really handy for people who do struggle with a bit of discomfort. It does take a little bit of, a little bit of art there. It does take a little bit of know-how, but it can be handy. Now, benefit number 2, and this is probably relevant for more people listening to this who are just figuring out their own training, it can be a simple way to vary exercises, especially when you are a bit limited on equipment. And vary just for variation to have something a bit different, or vary to make things more difficult. Because when it comes down to any type of training, as we always say on this podcast, progression is key because the body gets used to certain things relatively quickly. And we don't want to be doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again for months and months and months at a time. We want to be giving the body new stimulus and new things it needs to adapt and get stronger for. And, the typical way of going about that is, you may, do an exercise for like 4 weeks. And then the next 4 weeks, you might add some weight. Or you might change the way you hold your weight, or you might just do another exercise. And these are all great options. But another option you can do is just try doing some isometric stuff, whether you're adding little pauses and you're holding certain positions in that isometric way, or you're just doing certain exercises where you're just holding one position and doing that and then going back to whatever exercise or whatever it may be. And that can be it can just be a really great way to vary your training a little bit, especially if you're limited on equipment. And I'll go into exactly how, that may look in a moment. And benefit number 3, it can often be used to improve on particular weak spots in our training. Because the body has a tendency, and we have a tendency, if there's a certain angle, a certain position where the body is quite weak, or maybe not quite as strong as other angles or other positions, we typically, unconsciously, will sort of skip over those weaker spots. Because the body doesn't want to be uncomfortable. It doesn't want to be in a bad position. And we might be doing repetitions where we might skip over this, and then it just doesn't get the attention it deserves. A typical example of this is a squat. So in a squatting motion, we've all done a squat before. Typically, the weakest position of a squat, where the body is least comfortable, is the bottom position of a squat. Holding that bottom position. Now, typically the way we get around that is most hikers, they'll go down in their squat, and they won't spend any time at the bottom. They'll just go down, hit the bottom, and then come up. And they go down, and then come up. Go down, come up. And that bottom position, it doesn't really get the attention it wants. But when we're looking at the context of hiking, being in that bottom position is quite beneficial. Because those certain angles around the joints, it may be really beneficial when you're doing big step-offs off a rock, or big step-ups on a rock. Really, really beneficial when you're trying to go to the toilet on the trail. Well, not go to the toilet, but, relieve yourself on the trail. And developing this area can be very beneficial. So this isometric training can be a great way of just developing weak spots that we sometimes miss over. So with all that being said, now we should know what isometric training is and, what are some of the few benefits. How can we actually apply this into our training, and where might you use? Well, essentially, when I think about it in the context of training for hiking, there's sort of 3 different ways you may apply this into your workouts. Now, number 1 is you may use isometric training as just part of your normal exercises in your normal workouts, as just a way to make things a little bit more difficult for yourself. So what I would typically say is you may choose, say you've been in the same workout for 2 to 3 weeks, and you feel like, I want to make things a little bit more difficult, but maybe I don't want to use a bit of extra weight. Maybe I don't want to completely change my exercise or whatever it may be. You might sort of decide like, okay, 1 or 2 exercises. What I'm going to do is every single repetition I do in this workout, I'm going to put a little isometric pause at the hardest portion of that repetition. So every time I do a squat, at the bottom position, I'm going to hold that for 3 to 5 seconds. And I'm going to do that every single repetition I do. Or maybe you're doing upper body and maybe you're like, you know what, push-ups. I've been doing them for a while. I want to make this a little bit tougher. Maybe at the bottom of your push-up, you add a 2 to 3 second pause every single repetition. Or maybe you're doing chin-ups or pull-ups. Some people do. And maybe at the top, you might hold, the 4 to 5 seconds at the top of every single rep. But as you can sort of see, get the gist of it. Like if you're just adding this little pause at a difficult position on a repetition, that in itself is going to be a huge extra challenge. And you might go through one set just with those added seconds, and you might be like, oh my gosh, this is way, 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 way harder. And you might do that for a few weeks and then do something else. And that could be a really, really simple way of adding this type of training into your normal exercises. Now, the second way of going about this is you can use this type of training as standalone exercises and literally just instead of doing a normal exercise where you're going up and down, up and down, up and down, you literally replace that with one where you just hold one position. So a few great examples here is, if you've been doing calf raises for a while, maybe you've been doing them for a few weeks or even a couple of months in a row, and you've been going up and down, slowly progressing, maybe you might spend a few weeks just doing an isometric calf raise, where instead of going up and down, you literally just hold the top position for 40 to 60 seconds and then have a rest, then hold that top position, then have a rest, then hold that top position. And that could be a really good way of going about it. Or another great one is doing isometric split squat holds. So a split squat is pretty much the same as a lunge, except you're not stepping back and forth, but you've got 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, and you're just going up and down. So in this position, you're literally sitting in the bottom of that split squat position or that lunge position, and you hold that for 30 to 60 to 2 minutes if you're super strong. And you could replace lunges with that. Or maybe doing wall sits. And, if a lot of hikers have been doing wall sits already, you might do single leg wall sits and hold that for 10 to 20 seconds or something like that. Or maybe doing something called a Chinese plank, which, it's a bit hard to describe, but a Chinese plank is a really great exercise we use for a lot of our hikers who need to develop a bit of hamstring strength. And if you're not familiar with that, go onto YouTube, type it in. I'm sure no one's ever heard of it before, but it can be a great option. But essentially using these exercises just stand alone, just holding that one position, it's a little bit different, it's a little bit funky, but it can be a really, really good addition. Or number 3, you can use this this type of idea as a bit of a combination. So you might just say you're doing a set of squats, and you might do your normal squats as normal. You might do 10 squats. You might be planning to do 10 squats, and you do the first 9 normal. And you're just up and down, up and down, up and down. And on the 10th squat, maybe you're like, okay, at the bottom position, I'm just going to hold this for as long as I can. So you do 9 squats, and on the 10th one, you just sit at the bottom until you just can't hold anymore, and you sit on your bum or whatever it may be. And then you have your rest, then you do your next set, and you do the same thing. And you can sort of just add these sort of holds in, as a little bit of a combo. Or maybe if you're doing step-ups, maybe you might just do a full isometric hold beforehand. You might just do as long as you can with a single leg wall sit on each leg and then do step-ups afterwards. And you're like, oh, you know what? This is a bit tougher. My legs are tired. This is a bit of a change. Or whatever it may be. You can throw it in anywhere. But basically, you can get creative with it. But basically, when it comes down to, this type of isometric exercise, it's a really, really great addition to any hiker's program. Whether you're super, super, super strong or whether you're someone just starting out with strength training, it can be a really, really great thing to play around with. It doesn't really need much know-how. It doesn't need any equipment. It doesn't really need too much knowledge. It's very hard to do wrong, but it can be a great thing to incorporate into your workouts and have a play around. So if you have been looking for a way to kind of spice up your workouts, maybe you're looking for something to just try something different or whatever it may be, give one of those options a go. Add a little bit of isometric stuff and you might be surprised about just how difficult and just how satisfying it is. So all that being said, I think that's probably enough on today's episode. Hopefully this gives a little bit more clarity for people who've listened to the 300th episode and were wondering about this. And hopefully it gives a few great ideas for other people in the future who may be looking just to, other ideas for their training. Now, as always, if you are listening to this and you're like, you know what, sounds great, I love training for hiking, I'd love to get a bit of personalized help to, get fit, strong and resilient for my adventures. If that sounds like you and you want to find out a little bit more, as always, you can check us out at summitstrength.com.au/online. You can have a little watch through a video which talks through sort of how our programs go. And if you're interested in sort of getting involved, just learning a little bit more about how we may be able to help you, you can also book a call there. So I'll leave a link for that in the show notes below for anyone who may be so inclined. But aside from that, I hope you had a lovely, I hope you've enjoyed the episode today, and I hope you have a lovely, lovely rest of your day, and we'll talk to you very, very soon. Bye.